All right, for today's demonstration, we're going to talk about color theory. What we're working with is three primary colors, blue, yellow, and red. These are the primary colors that make up all of the other colors. So what I'm going to start with is, in my palette, I'm going to mix up some red, and I'm going to use just the red and the blue. So what I'm doing here is just kind of giving you a little snippet of what different colors you can make using the primary colors. This is probably not new information for any of you, but it's a good review. A review of what colors you can create by using the simple palette of red, blue, and yellow. So in my palette, I'm going to start with my blue, my red, and my yellow. And then I'm going to use my other circles or my wells to create the additional colors that I'm going to make. And I can see in my palette, somebody's leftovers are in there, so I'm going to clean that out real quick. If you see that there's other people's paint in your palette, you want to make sure you start off with a clean palette. Otherwise, those colors are going to start mixing on you. All right, so as I mentioned before, you are probably going to find that some of the colors in your palette, since you're sharing the palette pan with other people, some of those colors in your palette pan might already be mixed up. I'm going to try to clean out any old colors that shouldn't be mixed in there, so I have just the color I'm looking for. So in this case, I need a nice clean yellow. All right, so what we're going to be working with is, again, controlling our paintbrush. So I'm just making different circles in my demonstration. I'm not doing anything fancy, but again, this is just a review of color theory, the primary colors, and also learning to control your paintbrush. Yesterday, I talked about a wet on wet technique. So what that means is I'm going to wet the paper before I start. Hence the reason we're calling it wet on wet technique. Now, if you want your spheres to touch like they do in the example, then, well, and you can see my paintbrush wasn't completely clean, so that wasn't a very good example. But what I wanted you guys to know is that if your spheres are dry, like mine are, then you can go ahead and make them start touching, and you can make them kind of look like there's a sphere behind, or you can call them bubbles if you want. All right, I'm starting with a yellow. It's a good idea anytime you are going to be mixing a yellow with any other color. I like to start with a lighter color first. So in this case, I'm using my yellow first, and then I'm going to mix it with some red. What color are we going to get from mixing yellow and red? Orange. This is all a bit of a review from your childhood. Most people have learned these colors really early on in their, education, but it's a really good review. If you're learning to mix your own colors, it's a good place to start with your basic color palette of just red, yellow, and blue. So I'm mixing my yellow and my red a bit. I'm adding different amounts into each, as I'm just painting along, and I'm just playing with my colors and seeing kind of what I like. Yesterday, I started adding some details to my spheres using a stipple. So basically what I did is I just started adding kind of a little bit of a dab. I'm going to let this sphere dry, and then I'm going to be adding a little bit more detail. It's a mixture of some yellows and some reds, and it mixes and makes a bit of an orange. I'm going to add more details later. I'm going to go ahead and start working on a different bubble too. So I'm going to make sure my brush is nicely rinsed, and I'm going to start with my yellow again. So what I'm going to do is I'm using my pure yellow, and I'm going to just start to add a little bubble that looks like it is behind these other bubbles here.
Do you want it dark where it's touching the other circles?
So the objective is to make sure that you have, you're understanding what your basic colors can do. So with my yellow, I started with just a basic straight yellow, and now I'm going to start by adding some blue. Yellow and red make orange. Yellow and blue make green. Now when you're mixing watercolors, it tends to be a much more faint color than maybe you were anticipating. But it is a really good start. When you're using different paints like acrylic or using something like tempera paint, it makes a much more clear version of a green. So you're starting to see more of like a yellow-green color. So I'm gonna bring in a little bit more blue, and it's gonna start to adjust and become just a little bit more of a blue-green color. On top there, another thing that I'm doing here is I'm using very, very little paint and very little water. So it's a good little reminder for you to be real mindful that you do not need a lot of paint on your brush, especially when you are working with fine detail. Fine detail is never really done with a lot of paint on your brush. All right, so I have more of a blue-green color here. And here, down here, I think I had a little bit of a blue and the actual green that was in my palette mixed together. So you can see the difference here. This has a little bit more of a yellow in there and a little bit more, of a variation, which, I want you to be able to experiment and see what you can do when you're mixing your colors. All right, I'm going to start with another bubble and just kind of add it over here to the side. And this is going to be my red mixed with my blue. Red mixed with blue should create a violet. Now, my red and my blue, it doesn't really matter which one you start with, but I like to start with the lighter one. And in my opinion, that would be the red. So I'm going to make it look like it's behind the other bubble. And again, a big part of what you're doing is learning to control your paintbrush, control the paint, and try to keep it in the area that you want to paint. That is a skill that does take time to learn. It might seem like that would come naturally, but it doesn't for a lot of people. All right, so I'm starting with some red, and you can see a big reflection down at the bottom. It's actually not white down there, but now I'm gonna add my blue.
So I kind of messed up.
And this is gonna create a violet, or it might look more like a blue violet. It's just a little bit of practice. There's no right or wrong. So if you feel like you've made a mistake, no big deal. In fact, I think mistakes make the best art. A lot of my mistakes in paintings and things like that end up becoming a big part of the painting in the direction that it takes. All right, so now I have mixed. I started with my red, and now I've added my blue, and now it has more of a deep purple look, and that is exactly what I was going for. So another thing that we're going to be learning is adding a different element, which is your tints and shades. Now in your palette, you do not have a white, okay? So what we do have though is black. So what I'm going to do is now I have mixed my reds and my yellows and my blues, and I'd like to be able to show you mixing those with a little bit of black. So I'm going to start with my red, and I'm going to go ahead and just make another bubble here, maybe right off here. And this time I'm going to make some tints and shades of the red. So I'm not mixing my red with anything else. just gonna use my red. And in the areas where I want to show my highlights, much like I showed you in a previous video, I'm gonna leave the areas where I want it to be lighter, I'm gonna leave it white for right now. And then what I'm gonna do is I just rinsed off my brush, and now I'm just gonna real lightly tap that white area. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a highlight or also a tint of red. All I did was water down my red. I didn't have any white paint. I just took my red and I watered it down. I added water to my red. No extra red paint. In that area, I created a highlight just by leaving it white and adding just a little bit of water. And that made a tint. So I should probably write that on here. Another key term that you want to remember in color theory is tints and shades. Okay, so now on the side of my little red one here, I'm gonna start by mixing just a teeny tiny bit of black with my red. I'm actually gonna mix that in my palette. Here's why. So many people, when they go to add black to their paintings, anywhere in their painting, it is very, very easy for your black to overpower your painting. So I'm gonna mix my black and my red on my palette. I'm gonna get myself just a little bit of black. As a beginning painter, it's really helpful to start with black on your palette and not your paper, because that's where most of the mistakes happen. Black can be very powerful and definitely is a good color to use, but in this case, I want you to mix your red and your black in your palette. So what I'm doing is just creating a shade. So now I have a little bit of black mixed in with my red, and I'm gonna apply it to the back side of my sphere. And that's gonna create a very subtle shade on my little bubble. Now, if you're looking at it and you're thinking, I really don't see much, go ahead and add a little bit of black to your palette. Oh wow, look how fast that turned pitch black. This is why we do the practice or mixing of your colors in your palette. Anytime you're working with black, especially as a beginning artist, it's really a helpful tool. Black can very, very easily overpower and make it become a complete solid black. So I like to mix my colors ahead of time in the palette. Okay, so how about we do a black bubble? Then you can really see tints and shades with just a solid black color. So I'm gonna take a little black and I'm gonna put it in my palette. Tiny, tiny bit. I barely touched the black in my pan. And it is really powerful. You don't need to do much. I mean, barely the tip of your paintbrush. I'm talking like the very tip is all you need when it comes to adding black in watercolor. In fact, I very, very rarely add black to an actual watercolor. I actually do all of my mixing in my pan. I actually never go straight from my watercolor pan. That's this. Rarely do I go straight from my pan to my paper when it comes to black, because it overpowers your painting. But I know my students love to use black. Black is one of the favorites in my classes. So what I'm doing is I'm just gonna mix my black with some water in a little spot here, and then I can gradually darken my bubble. Now I need to make sure that I find a spot that is dry. If I hit any of these other colored spots that are still wet, the black is gonna bleed right into that area, which is definitely not what we want. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and make another bubble here. And you can see it looks more like a gray. So you could also call that a tint of black. So what I'm doing is I have a watered down version of my black, and that is creating a tint, or you can call it gray. Now I'm gonna gradually add just a tiny bit more black at a time. And I'm gonna start by using it on this back end. Now I'm starting to create some dimension with my bubbles. And now I have what looks like a nice highlight up here, and I have a deeper shadow on the bottom ring. I want to make or create the illusion that it is round and that it has dimension. Now I'm going to take those areas along the edge and I'm going to kind of spread that paint a little bit more. When you use actual watercolor paper, this is a much more pleasant experience, but you're just practicing. And it's okay to practice on drawing paper or scrap paper that you have laying around. So for today, you're using standard drawing paper, which is no problem. But when you do your actual project, you're going to be working with watercolor paper, which is much heavier and has a lot more weight to it. It absorbs the water really, really well, which also makes watercolor painting stand out a lot better. All right, so now I'm going to dip my brush in my water, and I'm just going to add a little bit here and just try to make a nice smooth transition from the dark area to the light area. So what I have done now is I've shown a tint of my black, and I have a shade down here. So it's created a bit of a shadow. None of these objects have shadows where they are. I'm making them look like bubbles. Bubbles float in the air. If I want to create shadows, I can most certainly do that. But if I create a shadow, I'm making them all look like they are on a surface or right above a surface. So I'm going to show you that with one of my next videos. For now, I think that completes today's demonstration.